Welcome to Laurier's Teaching Excellence Conversation Series. I'm Deborah Veninaton, Academic Director of Teaching Excellence and Innovation at Wilfrid Laurier University. Today, I'm with Amilah Baksh from Laurier's Faculty of Social Work, who received the 2023 Early Career Excellence Award. Amilah has a deep commitment to inclusive teaching practices and takes an innovative approach that looks to create spaces for her students to engage in their own development, leading them to transformational outcomes. Amilah's contributions go beyond her classroom to make deeply rooted changes in how her students see one another and the world around them. And I'm excited to talk to her today. I'm so glad to be here with you today, Amilah, and I want to talk a little bit first about where you draw inspiration for your teaching, because not only are you teaching in the social work program, you're also a practicing social worker. And you've been in a number of roles, mental health, justice, a few different areas. So I wonder if you could talk about how that has shaped your teaching practice, because that's, very unique.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's in the Faculty of Social Work, it's pretty common for a lot of us to have or continue that practice of social work as we're teaching. I think it shapes my teaching in very obvious ways, in the sense that the way I approach teaching is kind of like how I approach social work practice, which is rooted in strong relationship, rooted in love ethic, something that Bell Hooks kind of refers to as love
Yeah.
ethic.
Yep.
So deep compassion, care, and respect for service users is something that I try to bring into the classroom, in the sense of treating students or learners as equals, engaging in non-hierarchical relationships with them. So that parallel is very much there.
When I was reading your dossier, I was really drawn to a passage from your teaching philosophy where, just to follow up with something from Bell Hooks, you say that your approach has been deeply influenced by Hooks, who wrote that as a classroom community, our
Mm,
capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, and in recognizing one another's presence, right? And then you go on and you talk about how important communication and connection is
mhm.
in the classroom. Those things are really linked, of course. So, how do you bring students into deep communication with one another?
Mhm. The kind of fundamental social work skills that we teach, kind of like social work 101, if you want to think about it that way, is all about communication, right? So active listening, listening with empathy, listening with an intent to hear what someone's saying, as opposed to kind of what many of us typically do, which is just formulate the next thing that we want to say, right? So those are the kind
It's a
of
good way of putting it.
Yeah, and those are the kind of skills we're teaching students, but also modeling and practicing in the classroom. The classroom is really a place that social work practice can start. So one of the classes I teach, practice with individuals, right from the get-go, we start in with what do we need from one another to make this a space where we can really do that work. Many of us in the Faculty of Social Work and beyond use these kind of community guidelines or um, foundations for creating braver or safer
I
spaces
was
in the
just going to say,
classroom.
because
Yeah,
you're creating a brave space where people
yeah.
can be vulnerable, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, there's the usual kind of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas sort of rule. But, notions of confidentiality are very important to social work practice as well. So, just like we have that in social work practice, we model that in the classroom. That if, someone is sharing something, we're not talking about it outside of the classroom space. We're not telling other people who are not in that class. So, these are the things that also really parallel, again, social work practice, that it's important for everyone to learn those kinds of skills. How do you respect confidentiality in meaningful ways? How do you show someone respect through your listening? And I think it's really interesting because obviously respect shows up very differently for different people. For some, it's, respect is not being able to disagree. Like, I respect what you have to say, so I'm not going to disagree with you. So there are things that we kind of try and push back on a little bit as we're engaging with that those community guidelines too.
So walk me through. So you're starting a new class. You've got
Yeah.
a new group of students. How do you set those community guidelines? Right? Because I think a lot
Yeah.
of faculty think a lot about this. How do I set just the right tone where people can truly,
Hmm.
you know, learn and share and
Yeah.
get to know one another? And as I said, be vulnerable. What do you
Yeah.
do to get that established?
Well, I think right from the get-go, there are a few kind of things that I pull from that really influence my teaching philosophy. And so, the three kind of primary, I'll say, if you want to say branches of theory, or if you want to say just life philosophies,
Mm-hmm.
are my own religious and spiritual beliefs as a Muslim person. For Muslims, education is something that is rooted in respect. So, right from the get-go, students walk in the door. There is respect, a compassion, a welcoming of the whole person, which also branches into the next influence, which is Indigenous holistic theory and philosophy. Again, a really holistic approach to education and to the classroom that views students as whole people. We're not just engaging with the neck above the head, the cognitive engagement. We're
That's right.
engaging with spirit, with people's mental health and well-being, where that comes into the classroom and shapes people's experience. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, like bell hooks, but Black feminist theory and critical feminist theories that allow for that standpoint that, I'm a subjective person, right? My experience, my worldview is shaped by my positionality. I
Yeah.
have a standpoint.
Yeah.
So, right when students walk in the door, I'm acknowledging that. I'm sharing of myself. When I do that land acknowledgement, I situate myself, I situate my relationship with the land. What is my kind of ancestral history? What is the history that brings me to social work practice? So right away, there is this self-disclosure, this bringing of my whole self into the classroom. And then engaging in, for example, circle pedagogy, which comes from Indigenous
Yep.
pedagogy, allowing each student to engage without interruption, with the option for passing or not engaging, without any crosstalk, any interruptions, to really talk about what do you need from this space? What do you want from this space? And that usually sets us off on a pretty good foot.
So how do students respond to that right away when you do that, right?
I think there's always, the kind of first day energy, but typically it's very well received. I think students really appreciate being given the space to contribute as opposed to being told what is going to happen in this classroom. And obviously, I still come in with my syllabus. There is still a fair amount of direction
Yeah,
given,
yeah.
but they also have a chance, an opportunity to talk to me and talk to one another about what do they really need, again, from me and from each other to show up in this space and really learn.
Is it different in a class with somewhat larger enrollment, for example? Like a lot of our colleagues think,
Right.
how do I adapt what's working great in a small classroom
Yeah.
environment
Right.
to more students to still make people feel part of this
Yeah.
open, transparent, inclusive, brave space that you talk
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the kind of blessings of the teaching in the
about? Yeah.
Faculty of Social Work. I teach in undergrad and graduate studies, and in our graduate studies, I believe the cap is like 25.
Yes.
So we
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
pretty small classrooms where we can do circle pedagogy in really beautiful, meaningful ways because we have that time.
Yeah.
Everybody can contribute and not feel rushed. I think in larger classrooms, there are ways to do things like the think pair share, or like smaller group and bringing it back to larger group, right, where you can have students engage with one another and then engage back with the classroom as a whole, the
Yeah.
professor, in ways
That's
that,
great advice.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it is challenging. I've taught larger classes as well, and it's not always possible in the same way. But I think again, students really feel when there is that intentionality there of including them and bringing them into the conversation.
So, I want to come back just a little bit to, you talking about how you want to ensure that students are bringing their whole self to the classroom,
Yeah.
right? And um, they're not just individuals; they are operating within a system, right? And
Hmm.
there's certain expectations. Um, how do you adapt your teaching to respond to different needs, right? I think the current teaching context right
Yeah.
now is one in which students are coming to us with different sort of parcels that they're carrying,
Hmm.
right? How do you do that in the classroom? How do you respond to those differences in the classroom?
Yeah. I think there are two kind of questions that I hear there. One is sort of the, coming back post-pandemic, which we were talking about.
Yeah,
How do we respond to re-entering this space that we're all so familiar with, but has really changed fundamentally? And I think that there is a lot to be said about what we learned as educators during COVID and how that can be brought forward. So I think the biggest pieces for me have been flexibility, right? And this ties to so many things that are being talked about right now in
yeah,
terms of decolonizing education, and how we make education really accessible. um, One of the things that I've learned primarily from students with different needs, um, and coming from critical disability studies and that lens, is, do we really need the rigidity of due dates and deadlines and things that just increase and enhance students' anxiety? One phrase that I came up with that I always tell my students is, "I want your best work, not your stressed work." Right? Because in
I like
social
that.
work,
Yeah, yeah,
in social work, we're teaching students how to engage with service users, and so, how can I be an effective educator if I'm not also modeling that same kind of empathy and affirmation for students themselves that I want them to model with their, or engage with their service users,
right,
right?
right.
So I think, flexibility has been so important. I'm a big supporter of ungrading and thinking about how we can do that meaningfully in ways that, still hold us to academic rigor, and scholarly engagement, but create opportunities for students to engage deeply, as opposed to being focused on, am I going to get an A on this assignment?
Yeah,
Am I going to, achieve all these learning objectives and then forget it the second I walk out the classroom door,
yeah,
right? Because this is about, social work obviously is a professional degree program. We're teaching students to be social workers. So it's not,
yeah,
we don't have exams, which is another thing that I love about teaching in the
yeah,
faculty of social work.
yeah.
We don't do exams because that's not going to be what's most helpful to you in practice, right? Can you remember these dates, or this person's name, or, um, you know, that kind of detail? It's, can you do this work? Can you engage relationally with someone, make them feel listened to and heard?
Yeah, it's a focus on mastery as opposed to, what grade did you get,
Exactly.
right?
So
Yeah,
I think modeling all of that in sort of this post-pandemic re-entry into quote unquote normal teaching, which we said is obviously not really on the table.
no, no, not anymore. I don't think so. Another thing in your dossier is that you talk about the importance of critically engaged pedagogy, and
Hmm.
you do this in different ways. And I love, for example, the way you use the critical reflection journals.
Yeah.
And you're so honest about it in your dossier because you say students sometimes come to this like, why do I have to do this?
Yes.
What am I getting out of
Right.
this? Right? Can you talk a little bit about the critical reflection journals? Because this is
Yeah.
something I think our colleagues would love to hear about.
Yeah, thank you. I think, obviously we know critical pedagogy, the kind of Freirean approach to that type of sort of alternative to the banking model of education, right? Where we're really calling on students to reflect on their own experiences. Think about, how am I, a person in this world, shaped by the systems around
Hmm.
me?
Hmm.
Shaped by oppressive, dominant forces around me, and how do I participate in that? So that's something that for future social workers is so important, because social work as a field, historically and currently, is can be a very oppressive force in itself. A large history of social control, and again, kind of current manifestations of that. This is not just something that's historic or past. Students have to situate themselves in that professional context and
Hmm.
really understand, how do all parts of me impact this work that I'm going to be doing,
Right.
right? How do all parts of me react to, for example, seeing someone like me at the front of the room, right? That's been a big piece of something that I've had to engage with as an educator, is students receive things differently from me. And so when I talk about my own critical reflexivity in the classroom, that's part of what I bring forward to kind of, again, model, how can students really attend to, oh, a service user might not respond well to the fact that I speak with accented English, or might not respond well to the fact that I am a member of the queer community,
Mhm.
right? So I think it's important to be very honest about those things so students have a chance to reflect and really think about, again, what does this mean for the work that
How
I'm
do
going to
they
be doing?
respond to that?
Um, it's hit and miss. It is indeed hit and miss. I would say the vast majority of students really love it, really appreciate that I'm honest about my practice. I'm honest about missteps. That I do some of that critical reflexivity with them. There are some students who will react not so positively to this. For example, I had a student express that Amila makes everything about race. And this was in a
Ah,
class that was titled Race, Crime, and Gender. And so it struck me as very indicative of the fact that, um, there are students whose worldviews are going to be challenged by the content of what we're talking about. Anytime you bring social justice content, you bring anti oppressive content, anti racist content into the classroom, there is a risk that this is going to be deeply challenging to people's worldviews.
because people feel on the defensive, right?
Exactly.
So how do the critical reflection journals help with that? That's what I was
So,
thinking.
yeah, yes, exactly. So, the critical reflection journal is a space for students to engage in those thoughts, that questioning, that interrogation of their own personal beliefs, biases, internalized stuff. Let's say that
Yeah.
we pick up
Yeah.
from society around us, right? That all of us pick up, but to do so in a way that is private. It is a conversation between me and them. No one else sees these, no one else grades them. So, especially for students who are a bit more hesitant to do this engagement in the classroom setting, it works really well because you still have this space to engage with what you're reading, what we're talking about, but you don't have to, let's say, run the risk of feeling that shame or guilt in the classroom setting or feeling on the defensive because of what classmates or myself might be sharing.
And do you set a few questions to help them kind of start engaging in self-reflection, because
Yeah,
it's a practice. It's
yeah,
not something that necessarily comes easy,
yeah,
right?
absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things I always tell my students is that this is a practice that you need to take into your social work practice, right? So I
So
do.
get going now.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So learn,
Yeah.
and it's a skill. It's a
Hmm.
skill, and like any skill, it's something that can be enhanced
Yeah.
through practice,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, I often give them questions, and the questions I give them tend to focus not just again on the cognitive aspects of, what did you learn today, right? Although that's important, but including things like how did you feel?
How did you respond to
Yeah,
this material?
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
What were
that's
your
great.
embodied
Yeah.
responses? What did you notice coming up for you? And I talk about, for example, when I talk about anything to do with anti racism in practice, I talk about the responses of guilt or denial or zoning out, right? So, right away, even in the question, I'm normalizing some of that.
Right.
So they don't have to feel
Recognizing you may be feeling this and it's
exactly,
okay. So let's talk about it or
exactly.
write about it, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
write about it.
Is it handwritten or are they typing?
I've done both. I have done handwritten sort of at the end of class that it's kind of a journal entry
Yep.
that you just
Yep.
submit and then you're done.
Yep.
That I really liked because it was not only easy for students to just kind of do something in class and then be done with it and not have to think about it, but we know that, handwriting something actually activates a
That's
different
why I
part of your
asked.
brain.
That's why I
Exactly.
asked.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. So,
Yeah.
of course, kind of, again, since COVID, some of that had to
Right.
shift.
Right. Right. Right.
And so we still held it as something now that can be done as a more typically as an assignment, like that you type up and submit. But I still encourage them to do it kind of within the week so that they're reflecting on the content and on how they've been feeling. And actually, that has worked well because a lot of students will reflect not just immediately after class, but into the next few days.
Right.
And
Right.
they're still thinking about certain things that have come up. So I think allowing more space has actually worked well too.
Can I shift a little bit, but keeping in mind what you're saying about the critical reflection journals, case studies?
Mm,
So, case studies are a
hmm
wonderful way to really show students what You know, how you apply
Mhm.
some of the conceptual material that you're thinking, the theoretical and philosophical material to
Yeah.
real life,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you use a lot of case study work, which
Yeah.
again works very works very well for training social workers, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how you use case studies in the classroom.
Yeah. Again, like you said, I think it's important to remember that social work is a professional degree program. So even as we're
Right.
engaging with these,
Yes.
big theories, I always bring it back to, and what does
What
this mean for
happens if?
practice?
Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So what do you do with this content that you're learning, right? So I always tell students, any case study I bring in is they're real. They're either cases I've worked with, cases colleagues have worked with, of course, with details changed to protect confidentiality.
Right.
But these are real things that we come across in practice. And so, how are you going to use the theories that we've been talking about to inform the work that you're doing? While attending to some of the critical reflection pieces. So you're reading through this case study. Immediately, I'm calling students' attention to, okay, you have maybe a little paragraph or maybe a full page. What is your mind? What kind of blanks are being filled in by your mind? What are you starting to assume? And I'll have students talk through that, right? Because that's a good indication of where we might need to do some of that critical
Right.
reflection work,
Right.
right?
Right.
And then I have students think through, what needs to be done? What other systems need to be engaged? What is the work that needs to happen individually? But how is that in social work, we say micro content, shaped by the macro, shaped by the systemic forces, right? So again, kind of encouraging students to think both on the around the work that they themselves are doing, but also the limitations, acknowledging the reality of social work in the field
Right. Right.
is so shaped by the structural
Yeah.
forces around us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's very clear from all of the reference letters. You bring a lot of care to the classroom, right?
I
And
try to.
outside of the classroom,
Hmm.
right? So it's not just the subject matter, but it's how you interact with the students and how you support them, right? Talk a little bit about, how you do that and how it was impacted by the pandemic.
Mm.
Because being very hands-on and providing
Hmm.
support in so many different ways, it
Yeah.
looks different when you go online.
Oh, yeah.
And then, as we talked about before, then it looks different yet again as we're back.
Right.
So maybe you could reflect a little bit on
Yeah, I think it was I always tried to bring the energy of social work into the classroom, and so sometimes that meant students would feel more comfortable sharing things with me. Sometimes in office hours, in one-on-one meetings, things that they might not share with an educator outside of the context of social work,
that. Right,
right?
right.
And I think that again, part of that is due to the nature of what we're talking about. Students will, of course, reflect on their own life stories, their own mental health experiences, things like that,
Yeah,
right? So,
very consciously.
yeah,
Yeah,
so some of that content
yep.
sort of, let's say, gets activated by the material we're covering in class. So I think being able to support students again, within the boundaries of being very clear, just because I am a social worker, it doesn't mean I'm your social worker. And I think that that's, that
Right,
distinction and
right,
that boundary is very
right,
important.
right.
But being available to just talk to students about how things are going, those kinds of check ins before or after class or in office hours can be so meaningful to really, again, making students feel held and I don't necessarily want to say safe, but
Mm.
feeling that sense of respect and love that comes from being in a program like this.
You have also contributed quite substantially outside the classroom, and I'm referring here to your work in building the NIRE community. So, and I believe that stands for Normalizing Intercultural Relationships in Education, and that provides a protected space for students who might be experiencing isolation
Mhm.
and racism. So, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Nair started actually well before I began teaching in the faculty. It was initiated by international students who are primarily from African nations who were experiencing a great deal of isolation and also discrimination from classmates and colleagues and from instructors as well. And so Nair started as a way to kind of bridge this gap that international students were noticing between themselves and domestic students. And so they were doing wonderful things like they had put on equity certificates that students could attend.
All students to
Yeah,
try to get, to raise
exactly.
awareness on the part of all communities. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly, exactly. So it was always open to all students. But when I started, what I noticed was that the work that Nair was doing was also being done in other places. So, for example, Nair sits under the Equity Committee, which is a kind of more broader structure within the faculty.
right, right.
And so there was a lot of overlap in the work that was being done. But what I noticed was that there was also this missing piece of support for students who are specifically still experiencing these things: racism in the classroom, isolation, which was especially worsened during COVID because these students are only in class together. They're not
Absolutely,
getting
yeah,
that,
yeah.
lunchtime time or time in the halls, time on break from classes or things to develop that relationship. So there was a lot of isolation, and it was really impacting racialized students, especially Black students, because at the time that I started Nair, we were, still kind of coming out of this summer of. Um, Remarkable reawakening around
Right,
issues of racial
right,
justice, issues
right,
of anti-Black
right,
racism, the murder of George Floyd, which had
right.
taken place that summer and then kind of led to this resurgence of Black Lives Matter, was weighing heavily on a lot of Black and racialized
So you needed
students.
spaces to address that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, as faculty was trying to engage with this content in classrooms, there was still a lot of lack of understanding and a lot of harm created in classroom spaces where students who were not Black were trying to work through and understand some of what was going on. But unfortunately, what ends up happening is, and what ended up happening in this case, was that Black students and racialized students were harmed by that learning. So you have students kind of, making very stereotypical prejudicial comments that Black students are then having to experience, having to sit through,
Hmm.
and watch other people's learning and growth while being harmed by that learning and growth, right? So Nair
So how
started.
do you address that? I
Well,
mean, it's a huge question, but
yeah, I mean, I think there's two things that we have to consider. There's what's happening in the classroom when those comments are made, where again we go back to some of the community guidelines that we've
at the
talked
very
about.
beginning, right? Setting the
Exactly.
boundaries and the norms and
Yeah.
mhm.
And being able to interrupt those things when they happen and do something that we do in social work practice, which is stop the content and attend to the process, attend to what's happening in the moment.
Right.
And there are the things that happen outside of the classroom space, like Nair. So, students being able to process some of this, some of these harms, some of these experiences away from and outside of the white gaze, right? So, a lot of the Black students who participated in Nair talked about how important it was for them to have a space where they could be angry and not be perceived through this stereotypical lens of the angry Black woman.
Right, right,
That was so,
right.
so important
Yes.
because they had to be validated in these emotions and couldn't experience that validation when there were other students who felt fear or threats because of that,
Right.
right? So, what is a valid emotional response to some of that racial harm then gets perceived through a stereotypical lens, and ends up kind of creating further distance between students, creating harm, disrupting the kind of community development of the cohort as a whole. So, Nair became this space where students could let down their guard, and racialized students could be, build community with one another and be affirmed in their experience and be encouraged to think critically, do that critical reflection of their own, right?
But it's
As
been so
Mhm.
successful that other groups of students are modeling that, creating new affinity spaces, right?
Yes, yeah,
For the disabled and for queer identifying students.
yes,
So you've
yeah,
got these different things happening
hmm,
in different places within the faculty
yeah.
of social work. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I can't take credit for all of that because obviously I know I
No,
didn't come
yeah.
up with the idea of affinity spaces. So I'm not going to take credit for that. But I think that Nair was such a beautiful community was created. And again, this was created with the cohort that did almost their entire 2 years of graduate studies online. I think they had roughly 3 months together, 2 or 3 months.
So difficult.
Yeah, very, very
Establishing
challenging.
connections after that.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
incredibly difficult.
Yeah, and they've graduated since, and I'm still aware that many of them are still connected, and so that's been something beautiful to see as well. That there is still that connection that lasts 2 years after they've graduated. That they are still in relationship with one another.
I think a lot of our colleagues would ask you, what's one thing I could do to make my classroom more inclusive,
Mm,
to make it a safe, protected space,
mhm.
a brave space, you know?
Yeah.
What would you what would you
Oh,
say?
that's a big question.
I
That's a
it
big
is, it
question.
is, but even getting started,
Yeah,
right? And I know
yeah,
our colleagues think a lot about this, but
yeah.
or give us a few things.
I think to me the biggest thing, and this is probably the biggest learning that I've had in my few years as an educator in this space, is being brave enough ourselves to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
number one, and number
So you're
two,
modeling that.
yeah, and to be able to intervene. I think a lot of times our own kind of emotional state gets
Yeah.
activated by
Like,
some of
oh
the stuff.
no,
Exactly. Yeah,
what do I
we
do now?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, and
Rather
we
than saying, you know,
mm,
halt.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Let's stop, let's engage. And so we do two things. We kind of step back, and then things continue to maybe explode a little
Degenerate.
bit. Yeah,
Yeah.
degenerate, explode a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, so we step back, we kind of take our hands off, or we step back and shut things down so that there is no learning that can come out of
Right.
that.
No further dialogue. Yeah.
Exactly. And so in either case, students are either left dysregulated or left with a lot of questions. And I think that, and I'm still learning this, still working on this. This is definitely, again, a skill that can be built. But how do you actively engage in times when emotions are high? And again, one of the things we know about learning psychology is that you can't learn when emotions are high. So you have to attend to the emotions in the room before you can continue with class, before you can continue with content. You have to be able to attend to process.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things I was thinking about is you have really experimented with so many things already. When you say the few years you've been teaching, but you've already, you're using various teaching approaches, you're innovating, you're working in really challenging places. What do you want to try next?
What do I want to try next? I think one of the things that I would really like to push myself in thinking about and in enacting in classroom spaces, because I will say I've been thinking about it for a long time, but in terms of it manifesting in the classroom is decolonizing approaches to
Yeah,
education.
yeah.
Right? So, again, how do we actually meaningfully bring this into the classroom without co-opting indigenous cultural approaches and methods, but in ways that can really decolonize, not only the education in the classroom, what we're doing in that space together, but also our social work practice. Because these are, again, parallels, right, of what's happening in the classroom and what are students going to bring forward into their social work
And we
practice.
come full circle where we started with your interview.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's next.
And the PhD.
And the PhD.
which,
That's
which,
right.
yes.
We haven't even talked about because you're
Oh,
also
yikes.
working on your PhD.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
I am.
How
So
are you managing? How are you balancing all of that, keeping
I think that, again, social work is one of those fields where we really need educators who are skilled in social work practice, but are also skilled in education, in critical pedagogy, in
yeah.
engaging students. So trying to achieve that balance is a little bit tricky while also trying to, uphold the standards of academia. And if I want to be doing this full time, I need that PhD, right? But my own research is centered around gendered Islamophobia and social work education. So reflecting on some of those pieces that I mentioned of how students respond to me as an educator. how students engage with me, how my presence in the classroom itself is a bit disruptive and a bit unnerving for some. I've had students share that not only am I the first Muslim person they've seen at the front of a classroom, but I've had some share
Yep.
I'm the first Muslim person they've ever met,
That's
ever.
incredible. Yeah.
So it's a tall order, and
I was going to say
it's
that's a lot of pressure on you.
yeah, yeah. So that's something that through my dissertation I hope to explore. I hope to engage with other Muslim educators around how does our identity shape the work that we do, and the way that we engage students in the classroom.
Well, we look forward to hearing more about your academic work in this field, but also learning from you in terms of your teaching practice. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
My thanks to Amilah Baksh for joining me today, and I hope you will join me for more conversations that celebrate exceptional teaching practices, explore diverse teaching philosophies, and discuss the future of higher education and learning.